All right, everybody, so welcome back to another episode of Colton Posey Fishing. Today we're going to be talking about my top baits for March. Now, before we jump into these baits and stuff, there's one thing I want you to pay attention to, and you're probably not going to hear this from any other creators, but when you see me talk about one of these baits, do not, I repeat, do not just go out, rush, and buy anything that I'm talking about. Pay attention to the context of why I'm choosing that bait, just the reasons behind it. That is more important than the bait itself. The baits that I'm going to present to you are baits that I'm confident in with the brand and all that stuff. But there's a reason this time of year that I choose these baits over other baits, specifically when the water muddies up. But either way, stay tuned because it's something you don't want to miss. All right, so just sliding right into it, you know, during the spring, a lot of times we get a lot of rain. We get a lot of rain, your river system, your lakes and stuff like that will flood. They get muddy and it can become difficult fishing if you're not exactly sure what the fish are doing or what part of the transition they're in. So one of the best baits that you can use to cover a lot of water and find those fish, especially like today where, you know, these fish are not exactly up against the bank, but they're not pushed all the way out. They're kind of in between and they're not deep, okay? So when I say they're, you know, 20, 30 foot off the bank, they're not sitting in, you know, 10, 15, 20 foot of water. They're sitting like 2 foot, like they're staying up shallow, suspended and chasing bait. So this bait is really going to outperform most of the other baits in this scenario. That's going to be the War Eagle River Rat spinner bait. Now there's a trick that we used to do when I was a kid, and you know, if you got a bunch of these Willow to Colorado spinner baits, but maybe you don't have, you know, the any of the ones with the painted blade on it, just get your wife's fingernail polish, like some orange or something like that, and then just paint that kicker blade. That is typically going to be useful in those times when the water's extremely muddy, like today we're dealing with, like, it looks like a Yoo-hoo can out here. So that's when I'm gonna be throwing the painted blade. Now let's say you're dealing with some slightly stained up to, you know, kind of sort of muddy, just a few feet of visibility, then I'm gonna go with the regular one, just that regular, you know, Willow to Colorado kicker spinner bait. I typically like to stick to my 3/8 and my 1/2 ounces this time of year, but the water temperature is around 60 degrees. Some of these creeks we push to the back of them, they're around 66, and some of the main river parts is, you know, in that 63 to 64 range. But where these are really gonna shine is anytime these fish are pushed up in areas like log jams. So when you see those log jams, you know, on the side of your river system or on the side of your lake system after a good rain, these fish like to tuck under and around them. You can run these baits through it, you can run these baits over the top, you can run them on the outside. You can kind of cover both bases and find fish that are aggressive, because that's going to be one of the key things this time of year. You're looking for fish, in my opinion, this is what I look for anyways. You may be on a different pattern, but I'm typically looking for fish that are going to be most aggressive, fish that are feeding up and getting ready for the spawn, fish that are getting ready for the shad spawn. There's a lot of stuff going on this time of year with them transitioning. So, you know, you can find fish on the main, you can find fish out, you know, in the middle of your creeks and your pockets, your little coves, stuff like that. So, you know, there's multiple patterns to be had. So making sure that you have multiple different baits to cover those scenarios is definitely going to be a big key. So the next one I want to talk about, this one's really going to shine around, you know, your dock areas. So around docks and bluff walls and stuff like that. When those fish are kind of, you know, suspended in that upper 2 to 5 foot range, I really like them in the 5 foot range. If the bass are sitting somewhere around 5 foot deep and I can get this square bill making short cast around docks and stuff. But one of the key features about the square bill, which is a lot different, now I'm sure there's other brands out there. I'm not even sure if you can order this anymore, but it's the Lucky Craft. This is the Rick Clunn edition, and it's called the Rattler. So this thing has rattles in it, and it becomes real big handy around these areas that are, you know, very dirty water. So when we're dealing with very dirty water, but there's not a whole lot to throw at besides like docks, or, you know, maybe there's some bluff walls or something like that, but, you know, steady areas that you're not going to get hung up a whole lot. This bait really shines because I can cover a whole lot of water with it. With it having those rattles, it makes it super easy for those fish to find. Plus, this time of year, I like going with something with red eyes, especially if I'm dealing with muddy water and I'm throwing a white bait. I like something to be included on the bait that's red. It just, in my opinion, I believe it gives the fish a better target. When they see that bait, they can really hone in on that one specific area, kind of like when we were talking about the feather treble hooks on, you know, your top water baits and stuff like that. To me, this just gives them a way to target that bait, make sure that you get a hook in those fish. But you know, any type of square bill that makes a lot of noise. Now, if I'm dealing with clean water, I'm sticking to that same concept, but I may not want something that rattles, so something like a silent square bill crankbait. But typically I like going with the more flat side this time of year, and as it progresses into spring, I like going with more of the wider body styles that has that hard hunting action. So right now, if your water temperature is below 65 degrees, still focus on that tight wiggle. You may want to speed that bait up a little bit, but if it starts to climb up over that, go to your fatter body baits to give that bait more of a hunting action. It'll give it a little bit more action. Typically, those fish are more aggressive. Now, the next one, this one is just very versatile. So, you know, I can use this bait just about anywhere. You can use it around grass, docks, you know, just really anywhere, your flats, because a lot of fish like to push up this time of year on these flats and stuff. So being able to have a bait that can cover a lot of water, you can make long casts, kind of like during the winter when we're using swim baits and stuff. But that's going to be a rattle trap. Now, this is the Booyah Graffiti. I've become really fond of this. You know, a lot of times in the spring people talk about red. You know, you need to be throwing red, you need to be throwing orange. I've never really paid a whole lot of attention to that. My personal opinion on the matter is, if the water's dirty, I want something loud. So something red, something very chartreuse, something like that that puts out a lot of contrast in the water where these fish can see it a little bit further away. You know, they're not gonna be able to see it across the lake, but they'll be able to see it, you know, a lot further than they would something like, per se, green pumpkin. But using this bait around flats in those areas, in your creeks and in your little channel swings, and you know, when you're coming back in pockets and stuff where there's a ditch where it's super deep. So maybe you're cruising to the back or something and you start seeing a bunch of shad right in the middle. A lot of times, if there's fish chasing those shad, you can pick up these traps this time of year and bust up those bait balls, and it really fires up those fish. Because you got to think, guys, right now their metabolisms are still kind of low, especially certain areas depending on where you're at in the country with the water temps and stuff. So their metabolisms are still kind of low. They're climbing up. They're getting more aggressive as, you know, spring progresses, but at the same time, they're still a little bit slow when it comes to, you know, they're not just feeding all day where, you know, you get out on the lake and it's 10 in the morning and they're just absolutely just blowing up at every point you come to and stuff like that. So being able to locate those fish that are suspending and bust up bait balls and get these fish excited a lot of times triggers a lot of strikes. Now, this is one of those dub baits, okay? And what I mean by dub baits is, you know, I'm gonna bring it up and you're gonna be like, well, duh, everybody throws that this time of year. But there's a little bit something or a reason that I throw certain ones over other ones, and I kind of flip-flop. So that's going to be a chatterbait. Let's talk about the chatterbait a little bit. The jackhammer, which is what this is. I'm going with that spring crawl color, that red, simply because the water color is extremely muddy. So we got the red and the orange. They can see the bait from a long ways away. I've got the freeloader on the back of it. It just fits perfect. Now, if we're dealing with cleaner water areas where there's 3 foot of visibility, I will typically go to something like, you know, the white and chartreuse jackhammer. But a key feature this time of year is figuring out if these fish want a very hard knock kind of deal, because what the biggest deal with these jackhammers is when this thing moves through the water, that blade's ticking that head and it makes a loud thump sound. That's the reason it's called the jackhammer. Now, if you go to a different brand, a lot of the other brands, they don't necessarily do that. They don't bump the side of the head. So, you know, it's just putting out vibration in the water basically, but it's more of a tight, a high pitch, I guess you could say, type noise that's going through the water and vibration. So, you know, this time of year, kind of pick and choose that. Do I need something with a hard thump where these fish can locate it from a long distance if they're aggressive? Or do I need something that's got more of a high-pitched vibration that's more tighter together, that, you know, these fish can find pretty easily, you know, in 3 to 4 foot visibility type water? Another thing to really pay attention to is your trailers, because depending on the trailers that you put on the back of your chatterbait will depend a lot on how your chatterbait will react once you start reeling it. Some of them will be real darty and some of them will be more straight line. So, you know, paying attention to that. Do you want something darty? Is those water temperatures creeping above 65 and these fish are pushing up against the bank and they're real aggressive? Or do I need something that I can bring further out and I kind of want that straight beeline, something I can pop and stop every now and again or something like that? So, you know, just kind of play around with it. Mainly with the chatterbait, I'm focusing on areas that I think these fish are going to be pushed up. So, you know, around shallow docks, around shallow laydowns, things like that. Areas that I can call these fish out. So maybe they're in the back of a little creek or something at the very, very back, and there's a small run in, and you know, it's kind of a ditch, but it's shallow throughout the entirety of the back part of that creek. I can cast that chatterbait all the way to the back, bring it back to the boat, and I'm covering a lot of water, and I know if there's a fish in there and they are aggressive, then I can typically locate that fish with that chatterbait. So one of the other ones I want to talk about is some type of flipping bait. I like the sweet beavers, I like the rage bugs. There's multiple different flipping baits, okay? But this time of year, I typically don't want these appendages pulled apart or anything like that. I don't want a whole lot of flapping and moving around, okay? I want this thing more wavy. So keeping the appendages together as this bait will wave as it goes down, stuff like that. It seems to trigger more strikes. But when would I pick this up? When does it go through my mind, hey, I think I need a flipping bait more than I need something like a spinnerbait going through these laydowns or going through anything that may be up against the bank? Well, when I start seeing these fish start feeding on brim, so when you start seeing and hearing these brim popping and moving around, that's typically when I'm going to pick something like this up. Or if I'm around bluff walls and stuff, steep bluff walls, and the water temps climbed up and the crawfish are really moving around, you'll really start to see a lot more crawl activity, like with your baits and stuff. As that water temperature creeps in the 60s or above 60, you'll really start to see how often these fish actually feed on crawfish. But a lot of times it really the color is a huge thing when it comes to the crawfish this time of year, because these crawfish will start to molt and they're eating certain things depending on what creek you're in. Like, you can go in a creek and the crawfish are feeding on something in particular, and when they molt and stuff, their colors can change to like orange, or you know, you may go to another one, they'll be real blue because of something else that they're eating in that creek. So being able to keep multiple, you know, different colors, I suggest keeping something real natural like this. I think this is called sprayed grass. It's kind of got that green pumpkin and it's got a little bit of June bug in the front, and then, you know, keeping something that's got that bright orange or red in it, and then also keeping another color that mimics shad, because a lot of times you'll notice when you get up in these little coves and stuff, you'll be throwing baits in there and you'll see all these shad scurry around and stuff like that. So being able to mimic what these fish are feeding on at that particular time or in that particular creek is going to help you a ton. So either way, guys, I really appreciate it. I hope the video helped you. If it did, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, hit that subscribe button, comment down below if you have any questions, anything you want to add, or you just want to talk fishing. I love hearing from you guys. I'll see you next time.